Hello learners, welcome to the lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. In the previous two lectures, I have introduced the poet Langston Hughes, and I have provided a theoretical and cultural context in which the poems of Langston Hughes can best be studied, understood, and appreciated. I have provided an overview of the similarities and differences between the elegy and the blues song. I have also discussed the various positions taken regarding the blues as a cultural and ethnographic form by various African American writers, scholars, as well as poets. I have situated Langston Hughes not only as a practitioner of the arts of poetry, but also as a serious intellectual with opinions and positions with regards to the right and wrong ways of using a cultural medium to describe the experiences of the African American community. I have described how various African American writers took different positions with regard to the blues and how between these positions Langston Hughes can best be understood as someone who appropriated the blues and creatively remade the blues as a medium in which a particular form of collective grieving might be undertaken. Now, with that context, we are now very well placed to begin encountering the poems finally by Langston Hughes. The first collection, as I've mentioned in the previous lecture, that Hughes published was titled The Weary Blues. This collection was published in the year 1926, and it begins with a poem that is titled simply Proem, that is P-R-O-E-M. I will read this short poem, and we will use this opportunity to understand the various positions that Hughes takes as an African American poet and also as an intellectual with serious opinions to share about the history and culture of both racism as well as the African American community and what manner of intervention a poet could undertake. So with that context, this is Langston Hughes' poem titled Proem. Hughes writes, I am a Negro, black as the night is black, black like the depths of my Africa. I've been a slave. Caesar told me to keep his doorsteps clean. I brushed the boots of Washington. I've been a worker. Under my hand the pyramids arose. I made mortar for the Woolworth building. I've been a singer. All the way from Africa to Georgia, I carried my sorrow songs. I made ragtime. I've been a victim. The Belgians cut off my hands in the Congo. They lynch me now in Texas. I am a Negro, black as the night is black, black like the depths of my Africa. So that's the poem titled Proem. And the first thing to note is that it's composed of 6 stanzas. Each of these stanzas begins with a statement about the speaker. The first stanza and the last stanza, the 6th stanza, both have the same first line, that is, I am a Negro. This is a pattern that mimics the pattern of the blues song. Every stanza, a set of lines in which the first line is set differently from the rest of the lines. It is not an identical or direct mimicry of the blues song. That will happen in Hughes' second collection. But in this collection, Hughes is setting up the process of appropriation by which a poet can use the form of the blues song to express some universal and particular truths. So that's about the structure of the stanza. Now let us focus on the theme and the content of this poem. So every stanza begins with the poet or the speaker declaring a particular aspect of his identity. The first and the last stanza say the same thing. They repeat the same words. But the repetition in the sixth stanza is richer. It comes after certain evidences have been shared, evidence which substantiates the claim that's been made between the first and the last stanza. So the poem begins with a claim. What is that claim? The speaker claims to be a Negro with a capital N. And then the speaker defines exactly how and exactly why he is claiming this fact, this truth about himself. So after declaring that he is a Negro, the speaker declares that he is black as the night is black, black like the depths of my Africa. So the color black here is linked to two things. On one hand, it is linked to a natural universal description. That is, in the nighttime, there is a lack of natural light. So the nighttime is dark, it is black. This is the universal and natural definition of blackness. The third line of the stanza connects blackness not to a natural or universal fact, but to a specific geographical location. That is the continent of Africa. The speaker declares that he is black like the depths of his Africa. Right? Now, he is referring to a particular geographical location, but also a particular historical movement, a historical event. The historical event is the trade, the transportation, the sale, and the purchase, and the trade of black bodies as commodities. The name for this process is slavery, and the poet refers to that historical event and connects that to his identity. He says that he is black like the depths of his Africa. So it's not just a physical description of dark skin, rather this event, the trade of black bodies as property, the violence that was inflicted, that history makes this identity something very dark. So this is the claim that the poet begins with. The subsequent stanzas will offer more details, some historical details about how and why this claim that the poet is making is actually a true claim. It is demonstrated, substantiated by historical facts. So the second stanza changes the structure of the first sentence. While the first stanza began, I am a Negro, it was the present tense, an eternal present, I am a Negro. The second stanza begins, I have been a slave. So there's a certain historical slippage in this sentence here. The speaker, if we can assume that the speaker is not Hughes himself, but a contemporary of Hughes, a person, maybe a poet or a writer, living in the same time and place as Hughes, it is simply not true, factually speaking, that a person who was alive in Hughes's time could have been a slave. Slavery was abolished many decades ago. So it is not true that the same person has had the experience of slavery. So then how is the poet claiming that he has been a slave? This claim is true if we can understand the subject or the autobiographical subject not as an individual, but rather as an identity. Not one person, but an aggregate of every African American individual. If the speaker is not an individual, but an aggregate of many individuals, then they can accurately claim to have been a slave at some point. The person who is speaking these lines is speaking for others like him who have been slaves. And then he describes in what contexts he has been a slave. He says, Caesar told me to keep his doorsteps clean. Caesar refers to ancient Rome. Right? Uh, the recent historians have established that there were Africans who were transported and who were made to do physical labor in ancient Rome. So slavery existed in ancient Rome. It was not the same kind of slavery that was practiced in 18th and 19th centuries in Europe and America, but it was slavery because there were African people who were employed in these tasks. Third line refers to the kind of slavery which historians of America are more familiar with because there is a name of Washington. He's referring to George Washington, the first American president, who is well known and well documented to have slaves. Slavery was legal at the time America was constituted, at the time of American independence. In fact, the Declaration of Independence, the US Constitution, all of these documents were written at the time when the founding fathers of the American nation owned and traded in African individuals as slaves. So, slavery is constitutive of the very foundation of the American nation. And here, Hughes and the speaker of Hughes's poem is connecting himself to that very, very complicated history of the American nation. He's saying that I brushed the boots of Washington. So there is an essential identity of all African American subjects, and it is essential to the identity of America itself. So the second stanza refers to a particular form of identity, that is slavery, the lack of freedom, and the ability that some people have to force some other people to do something against their will. It is an unequal dynamic of power. African individuals, African American individuals, have been at the receiving end of the power of others because of the color of their skin. This is what the experience of slavery in both of these contexts, ancient Rome as well as late 18th century America, has in common. Now, the third stanza refers to a different aspect of the African American identity, not simply the lack of power or the lack of freedom that comes with being an African slave, but rather it is the ability to do physical work. Whether one does that work out of one's free will or one is forced to do. So the examples that the speaker of the poem gives for being a Negro and how being a good worker connects to being a Negro is the way certain buildings, iconic, magnificent and miraculous buildings were built. They were built by the use of the labor of black African subjects. Again, the first example is from the ancient world, and the second example is from the contemporary American world. The first example is that of the pyramids in Egypt. The speaker says that it was African slaves who helped the pharaohs in Egypt build the pyramids. Just like that, right? As a continuation of the history in modern 19th and 20th century America, buildings like the Woolworth Building, an iconic structure that signifies economic prosperity, well-being, the success of the American nation. The Woolworth Building, a site of business and commerce. That building was also built with the labor of African American workers. So being a worker is almost as essential to the identity of the speaker who claims to be a Negro as being a slave. So two aspects, two essential characteristics of being a Negro are defined. The first is being a slave and not having freedom. The second is being a worker. Now, two more characteristics are provided. The third and the fourth characteristics that substantiate the speaker's claim of being a Negro are that he's a singer and that he's a victim. He's a singer because through these experiences, right, through these experiences of sorrow, joy, pain, pleasure, he or others like him, that is, the aggregate African American individual, has created songs. The first is the example of the spirituals, and the definition of the spiritual is given here, that it was a sorrow song that was made when the poet or others like the poet, ancestors of the poet, were transported from Africa to Georgia. Africa to Georgia is one example. Of course, there are other itineraries, there are other routes. But one thing that was common to all these routes was that they began in Africa and they ended in America. This was the Middle Passage. This was how slavery was instituted. And the speaker of Hughes's poem says that it was not only by being a slave that he becomes or he is a Negro, but also because of the songs that his ancestors made while they suffered the pain, sickness, injury, suffering, and death. While they were transported, they created songs to describe these experiences. It is these songs which also make, which also substantiate the poet's claim of being a Negro. Finally, the fourth characteristic that the speaker provides is that he's been a victim. The victim here is somewhat similar to the experience of being a slave, but it is much more violent. The examples that the poet gives of being a victim is that of the imperial exploitation, the imperial occupation of the African nation of the Congo by Belgians. This was a very, very notorious and infamous occupation in which in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Belgian nation, the Emperor of Belgium, decided to occupy Congo in order to extract resources, chiefly ivory, but several other resources, mineral resources. And this was done not only without the consent of the native citizens of the Congo, that is, African people, but also through extreme violence, extreme suffering inflicted on the natives of the Congo. It was also known that after certain work was done, the Belgian emperor had ordered the amputation or the cutting off of the hands of certain workers, certain African workers in the Congo. This is again a historical example, an example of black victimhood taken from a context outside America. And the second example is taken from within America. The third line of the stanza is that they lynch me now in Texas. Lynching was the public hanging, sometimes also the public torture of black individuals by a community or a group of white individuals, which took place in many states in the American South in the 20th century. I will describe the history of lynching in greater detail subsequently, but for now, it's important to note that Hughes' speaker refers to the history of lynching to connect himself to a larger community and a larger experience of African American subjects. And the definition of victimhood that emerges from these two examples is that black lives were considered less valuable. In fact, the life of a black person was not considered even fully human by ideologies of the time. These were ideologies that were created by people who believed in the supremacy of the white citizen. So this makes everyone who has black skin, like the speaker of Hughes's poem, a victim. So these are the four essential categories, experiences and emotions, which define the speaker's identity. And he has proven through these four stanzas why he is claiming to be a Negro. So he ends by repeating the first stanza and by defining blackness both as a universal natural category, that is the lack of light in the nighttime, as well as by referring to a particular geographical location and a particular history, the location of Africa and the history of violence that accompanied the transportation of individuals from that location, Africa, to Hughes's current location in America. So with this historical overview, Hughes begins his first collection. The first thing to note is that such a beginning places the reader in a particular relationship to the context that Hughes is writing about. Hughes is placing race at the primary and central location with regard to his poetry. Race is important. It is undeniably important. Without an engagement with the race, with the ethnicity, with the history of African American communities, it is impossible for any reader to understand exactly how and why these poems are written and how to read them. So that's the first thing that this poem establishes, the importance of race for Hughes and for this collection of poems. The second thing that it does is that it creates an essential racial identity. The word essential is important because Hughes, as an individual, has not experienced all of these events, all of these movements, all of these trajectories individually. So it is not an autobiographical experience of the individual Langston Hughes. Nonetheless, Hughes is able to appropriate, able to connect himself to these experiences that other black people have had. So despite not having experienced slavery or violence or the lack of freedom that comes from being black, so Hughes has not been a worker or a victim or a slave in the way that he's writing about. But because Hughes is black, because Hughes thinks and cares and has strong opinions and is constantly trying to come up with an intellectual model for writing about race, for addressing race, he is qualified to appropriate some of these experiences, to claim them as his own, even though as an individual he has not directly or personally undergone those experiences. This is a very important claim. Hughes is establishing himself in the intellectual tradition of Negritude. He is saying that even though he has not been a slave, he has a certain claim, he has a certain intellectual authority and a certain moral right to these experiences of slavery that other individuals have had. That is not only because Hughes is black, but because Hughes is engaging with the history of blackness and trying to create a mode of writing, a mode of cultural expression that would do justice to that historical experience. Now, with that theoretical, cultural, and intellectual background, we are now well placed to study and understand a poem which I consider to be the most iconic and the most powerful in Hughes's first collection. And that poem is titled The Weary Blues. The Weary Blues is the poem that gives Hughes's collection its title. And so it is quite obviously important. The signal that the poem gives to the reader is that this poem is important enough to give the collection its title, and therefore what is true about this poem must be true in some way about the entire collection as a whole. The first thing to note about the Weary Blues is the way it signifies both a particular cultural tradition as well as a particular expression within that cultural tradition. So the Weary Blues describes both the tradition as weary, that is to say, the blues music tradition is a weary tradition. It is weary because it repeats itself. It has a somewhat limited repertoire of emotions, and it can get quite boring because they only write about experiences of sadness or dejection or rejection and so on. This is one way in which the title The Weary Blues is a comment on the blues as a tradition. And as a poet, Hughes has some complaints of this kind. Hughes believes that the blues needs to be renovated, it needs to be updated, it needs to be modified and made more dynamic in order to enable poets do their work. So this is the first way in which we can interpret the title, The Weary Blues, as a comment on the tradition that blues music was. The second way in which we can interpret the title, The Weary Blues, is by reading it as a description not of a tradition, but of an individual performance within that tradition. A particular singer, a particular blues singer, gives a performance, and the poet happens to observe, attend that performance, and finds something weary, something quite tiring, something quite tiresome in the performance that he witnesses. So the blues themselves are fine. They're quite capacious, they're quite wide-ranging, and they allow for a more wide range of expression. But this particular performance that the poet happens to witness was weary. That is, maybe the singer was tired. Maybe the singer was quite obsessed with a limited set of feelings. And that is why this particular appearance or this particular performance was weary and not exactly representative of the tradition of making blues music. So both of these meanings of the title, The Weary Blues, will be demonstrated quite actively in the poem that we will just read. So this is how Hughes begins The Weary Blues. Droning a drowsy, syncopated tune, rocking back and forth to a mellow croon, I heard a Negro play. Down on Lenox Avenue the other night, by the pale, dull pallor of an old gaslight. He did a lazy sway, he did a lazy sway, to the tune of those weary blues. With his ebony hands on each ivory key, he made that poor piano moan with melody. So the first stanza ends by establishing exactly what the poet is going to do. The poet is going to give us his experience of observing another performer. So the poet himself is a cultural performer of a kind, and he gets an opportunity to observe and to witness a cultural performer of a slightly different kind. And we know that there is a slight difference, or there is a gap between these two performers, which is not just the natural gap between two human beings, but that there is some distance, intellectual, cultural, maybe even moral, between these two human beings who are performing texts and narratives from different traditions. We can conclude that there is a distance of some sort between these two human beings because of the way the third line of the poem is written. It says, "I heard a Negro play." These words signify that the experience of listening to another person produced a reaction, produced an intellectual reaction in the poet, and that intellectual reaction is the motivation for this poem. I will stop this lecture here, and I will continue with the close reading, commentary, and explication of this poem, The Weary Blues, in the next lecture. Thank you.